January 15th, 1944. 1944 has begun, and in only a few months' time, the United Nations Alliance plans to land in northern France and begin liberating Western Europe from Nazi occupation. D-Day will depend on organized cooperation by the French resistance. Liberation of France will require an administration to take over from the current collaborationist French regime. Unfortunately, Free France, Great Britain, the US, and La Résistance itself have managed to turn both resistance and the effort to form a government so hard into the ground, into the cells of the Gestapo, to be more precise, that it is for all practical purposes non-existent, at least as a unified movement. That is, if one can speak of any unified French organization to begin with. As the year begins, the Allied leaders are scrambling for a Hail Mary pass to get it all back off the ground. But who shall throw the pass? Who shall receive it? With what ball they're playing, what rules they're playing by, and even what field they are on is something they seem to still not agree on. This week, Churchill says, "To hell with it," grabs a ball and makes a pass to de Gaulle, who, would you believe, receives and runs with it. Will there be a last-minute touchdown? This is War Against Humanity, a series of World War II in real time. I'm Spartacus, Olsson. Last week, we saw how the Bengal famine is declared a thing of 1943, but how suffering continues as many Bengali people still lack food and clothes as they enter 1944. In Italy, Count Ciano and 4 other high-ranking fascists were convicted of treason. They're sentenced to death on January 10th. In Yugoslavia, Operation Waldrausch started, seeking to secure supply and communication lines between the central Bosnian territories and the Adriatic. That operation continues this week, but fighting is scattered and the events lost to the fog of war. What also continues is the Soviet advance into Poland that began last week. The Polish government's fear that this might be a liberation disguising new occupation is confirmed on January 11th. That day, the Soviet news agency TASS announces what the de facto dictator of the USSR, Joseph Stalin, had already agreed with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and US President Franklin Roosevelt in Tehran last year, that Polish claims to its eastern territories are void. They argue that the Riga Treaty of 1921, which established the pre-1939 Polish-Soviet border, was forced upon the Soviet Union, and that the population of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus voted to be incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1941. They argue that this is in the interest of fairness to the language ethnicities of the region. The entry of the Western Ukraine and Western Belarus into the Soviet Union not only did not interfere with the interest of Poland, but on the contrary created a reliable basis for a firm and permanent friendship between the Polish people and the neighboring Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian peoples. The post-war Polish-Soviet border will now be drawn along the Kherson line, established as a demarcation after World War I, and running north to south east of Bialystok and Lublin, excluding Brest and possibly Lvov from future Poland. To compensate for this loss, Poland's western border must be extended through the joining of the age-old lands of Poland taken away from Poland by Germany, without which it is impossible to unite the whole of the Polish people in its own state, and with which it will obviously acquire the necessary outlet to the Baltic Sea. In effect, the Polish Republic takes a big step to the west. The claims of the Soviet Union may not look completely outrageous at first glance, but they are ignoring some recent historical facts. When the Red Army marched west into Ukraine, Romania, Belarus, the Baltic states, and Poland in 1919 and 1920, they were not unilaterally welcomed as socialist saviors from capitalist oppression. These countries had just declared independence. The right to do so had been cemented by the international community at the Paris Peace Conference, albeit without Soviet participation. In all these places, there were supporters of becoming parts of a Bolshevik empire, but that was not the majority support. As a result, except for Belarus that collapsed into Russian control under an internal socialist uprising, the nascent nations fought fiercely to hold on to independence and avoid the socialist revolution. Now, while the Russian Red Army invaded, so did the Russian White Army and other regional factions. Poland also attacked Lithuania and West Ukraine. In the end, the Baltic states, Romania, and Poland prevailed. Ukraine, on the other hand, found itself caught between Poland and Bolshevik Russia. The choice fell on Poland, and with agreement that a future Ukrainian-Polish border would follow the Kherson line, they joined forces against the Red Army. The Polish forces forced the Bolsheviks back into Belarus in the north and seized parts of Lithuania's claims, including its designated capital, Vilnius. Further south, the war-tired Ukrainian forces could not muster enough strength to resist. With the Treaty of Riga in 1921, most of Ukraine came under Bolshevik Russian occupation, and a significant part of West Ukraine became part of Poland. Now, the West Ukrainians may not have chosen to become Poland, but they had also made a clear choice against the Soviets. To oversimplify, they had ended up with what they believed was the lesser of two evils. Not only that, both in the West and the East, these were the borderlands between language ethnicities, with large Ukrainian and Polish-speaking populations living side by side in the East, and Polish and German-speaking people in the West. Like everywhere in Europe, it was impossible to create pure ethnic nation-states by drawing lines on a map without leaving some people on the wrong side of the border. With the status quo created by the Treaty of Riga, ethnic conflict did not disappear on either side of the Polish-Soviet border, but what was now Eastern Poland remained opposed to an incorporation into a Bolshevik empire, even if that would unite them with their Ukrainian neighbors to the east. We saw the effects of that back in 1939 when the USSR invaded Poland the first time during the Soviet-Nazi alliance and proceeded to deport, terrorize, or murder hundreds of thousands of Polish citizens of both Polish and Ukrainian ethnicity to quash anti-communist sentiment. So in sum, the moral socio-cultural claims made by the USSR as justification for their land grab are tenuous at best, but most certainly contrary to the international order of respecting treaties and other nations' sovereignty. Some people in the region may support it, but in 1944's recent history, the vast majority have not. The more cynical observers see this as a resumption of the renewed Soviet Western expansion that the Polish army halted in 1920, which Stalin began again when he seized parts of Poland, Romania, and Finland, and all three Baltic states in 1939. While Churchill and Roosevelt may not have seen any practical way of stopping him, they are in principle opposed to the idea, and it does worry the Allies. American intelligence reports suggest that Stalin's war goals go much further than Eastern Poland. They conclude that he's probably aiming to establish Soviet governments in Romania and Yugoslavia, even annex Bulgaria completely into the Soviet Union. Conflicting assessments by the U.S. government suggest that Stalin is moving towards increased international collaboration, and his end goal is the restoration of his June 1941 western border. In other words, get what Hitler already gave him in 1939 and be done there. While some U.S. officials fear a spread of Bolshevik infection, their colleagues in the health department are gripped by the fear of an actual medical epidemic in Naples, Italy. On January 13th, the U.S. Typhus Commission warns of an outbreak of louse-borne typhus that is plaguing the local population under U.S. administration. Now, that's not a local problem. Naples is a major logistics hub, and thousands of Allied soldiers pass through the city every week. They report that under the unhygienic squalor created by the war, the disease has now been spreading since July and is on the cusp of an uncontrollable epidemic. Between July 1943 and the spring of 1944, 2,000 cases of typhus will be reported. Roughly a fifth of these are lethal. But compared to the total population of Naples at this time, which is between 750,000 and 1 million in December 1943, the outbreak is negligible. That is largely thanks to a concerted effort by the U.S. Army to fight the disease by systematic delousing and quarantining those who fall ill. After the war, the U.S. Typhus Commission will report. Here it was, for the first time, that a major epidemic of this vicious disease, which characteristically strike men when they are down, was not merely curbed, but actually brought under control by the vigorous application of delousing measures. A victory for humanity in these trying times, but a victory that unfortunately comes with a dark lining. The colorless, tasteless, and almost odorless pest control they douse on hundreds of thousands of civilians and military, their sleeping quarters, their homes, and their clothes is DDT. In 1944, this effective, efficient, and easy-to-use substance seems like the perfect remedy. But sadly, DDT, or dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane, is a highly toxic, carcinogenic substance that will be at the center of a global environmental and human health crisis a few decades later. Whether the typhus outbreak or the lasting effects of DDT would be the least lethal alternative in the long run remains inconclusive. Meanwhile, ill health is also plaguing two of the leaders of the United Nations. In Washington, D.C., Roosevelt has the flu and delivers his State of the Union address via letter to Congress, which he reads to the public over radio from the White House. Churchill remains in Marrakesh, Morocco, after the December conferences there. He's unable to fly back home as he is recovering from pneumonia. Well, that's the official story. He's really recovering from a heart attack he suffered 4 weeks ago on December 14th. Clementine, Churchill's wife, and his physician, Lord Moran, have judged it prudent to alarm neither Winston himself nor the public as long as recovery is proceeding. Also, as the heart attack has led to congestion of the lungs, pneumonia is arguably not wrong, just not the whole picture. In any case, by now, Churchill has resumed work more or less fully, and at the top of his agenda this week is to meet with leader of the Free French, Charles de Gaulle. Here's the thing. There is trouble among the Western Allies that directly impacts the war against humanity. In vastly oversimplified terms, Roosevelt doesn't want de Gaulle to be the leader of the French without a democratic decision after France has been liberated. De Gaulle loathes Roosevelt for snubbing him. Churchill is sort of caught in between, but is in the uncomfortable position that a slew of clumsy operations of his secret services, mainly the SOE, have contributed to the collapse of French resistance by allowing the Gestapo and French Vichy police to infiltrate and unravel it, which, as we have seen, has led to many of the leaders and whole cells being captured and killed. Already before that, La Résistance was fractured by political and ideological divisions, and de Gaulle is right at the center of those internal conflicts. Now, with the invasion of Western Europe, Operation Overlord, approaching, the Allied forces need support by the resistance. On this issue, the Allied leaders and La Résistance itself are also divided. De Gaulle wants them to become a well-organized, powerful, irregular fighting force behind the lines, and to set up a civil administration to take over France immediately on invasion. Roosevelt wants little of that, especially not the political part. He foresees a United Nations-led military administration until elections can be held. Churchill, drawing lessons from the effectiveness of Tito's partisans to hold up German forces in occupied Yugoslavia, has pivoted towards a limited military involvement, mainly sabotage and intelligence. He has less problems with de Gaulle's political plan than Roosevelt, but takes more of a humanitarian than political role for a French interim government. The elephant in the room that until now no one speaks out loud, but all are painfully aware of, is the French civilian population. Without an effective fighting force to interdict movement and force concentration by the Wehrmacht behind the front lines, the interdiction campaign will have to be carried out by bombing, which will inevitably cost more French civilian lives than German military lives. Churchill has also hit the nail on the head about administration. If the French do not themselves take charge, it will be nigh impossible to make sure that food, health, and emergency services are delivered promptly. British intelligence has concluded that unifying the French resistance under de Gaulle's government is the only way forward. Last October, the SOE reported that the only workable system would seem to be for SOE and the reorganized French services under the Comité Français de la Libération Nationale, CFNL, in Algiers to make contact with groups of resistance at the lowest echelon. It will be necessary to establish communications with them directly and to see that no communication pass through the already tainted lines of the old structures in France. Arms and materials must be delivered to them direct and not through the intermediary of the central control. Instructions for sabotage and orders for D-Day will likewise have to pass to them direct, either through the intermediary of an agent sent for the purpose or through wireless, but again, not passing through the central control. However, anything and what anyone wants is academic as long as La Résistance remains hobbled by the enemy and is infighting about ideological direction and the future of France. It is the latter that Churchill and de Gaulle now try to solve when they meet on January 12th. De Gaulle is still heading the CFLN, aimed to unite the resistance factions. However, since last summer, when the Germans captured and murdered de Gaulle's deputy Jean Moulin, whose Central Bureau of Intelligence and Operations, BCRA, was the executive organization for unity, La Résistance has fallen back into its uncooperative mode. The centralized BCRA still exists, but it doesn't enjoy the power that it held briefly under Moulin. The remedy that Churchill and de Gaulle agree on is an increased role of the Consultative Assembly, so far a mostly symbolic body with representatives of all factions that has only met once. De Gaulle now calls for a second meeting in Algiers later this month. Two of the most embattled and opposed resistance leaders, Henri Freinet of Combat and Emmanuel Dastier de la Vigerie of Libération, get ministerial posts in the CFLN, reporting directly to de Gaulle. Freinet approaches John J. McCloy, assistant to the American Secretary of War, and convinces him to send a memorandum calling for aid to the War Department by mid-January. Churchill meets with Vigerie in Marrakesh on January 14th. Echoing Churchill's directive for the SOE to set Europe ablaze, Vigerie lays out his plan to set France ablaze, and Churchill promises that arms and funds will be sent as soon as possible. And while the British government decide to ship arms, the German Nazis continue shipping human cargo to their deaths. After the liquidation of all ghettos in occupied Eastern Europe, any Jewish people who were not immediately murdered are now imprisoned inside the 1,000 Nazi concentration camps. There, they will be worked to death as slaves alongside political prisoners, Red Army POW, convicted criminals, and smaller minorities the Nazis are suppressing. The number of non-Jewish prisoners has grown gradually so that they are mostly held where the Nazis want them. The tens of thousands who arrived in bulk after the liquidation of the ghettos were times sent to a camp where the workforce was already filled. The surplus of human bodies this has created has to be adjusted. They are again loaded onto cargo trains, at times to another concentration camp, more often to a new round of selection at the only remaining death factory at Auschwitz. Most will be murdered on arrival. Some will be selected again for enslavement inside the sprawling camp complex of 3 main camps and their distributed subcamps. This week, on January 12th, around 1,000 men and women arrived from the Stutthof camp near Danzig. On the next day, around 2,000 arrived from the Sosnowitz and Bensburg camps in the area around Sosnowiec in Upper Silesia. The latter two are subcamps under Auschwitz administration where the construction work the slaves had performed is now concluding. Of the roughly 3,000, close to 2,400 are murdered in the gas chambers on arrival, and 611 men and women are selected for continued enslavement. In the women's camp, the murder tally for the first 2 weeks of January registers 700 women murdered in the gas chambers, women who had until then been enslaved in the camp. 6 newborn are registered in the Zigeunerlager, the family camp for Sinti and Roma. On January 14th, Karolina Horvath is born. She will die on March 14th. The other 5 are registered the next day. Hedwig Weiss, who dies on February 14th. Ludmila Daniel, who will only live for 10 days. Anna Horvath, who doesn't survive the week. Renate Faust, who will succumb on February 18th. And Anton Peter, who will manage to cling to life until April 24th. It is near impossible for a newborn infant to survive the squalid, unhygienic conditions of the camp. But some pregnant women hold out for the tiny sliver of hope there is, while others get help from their fellow inmates to perform dangerous abortions that often kill both mother and child. Pregnant women, especially outside of the Zigeunerlager, are at high risk to be selected as human guinea pigs in Dr. Klaus Klauberg's laboratory for infertility and sterilization experiments. They will be subjected to horrific torture that almost always ends in death. Jewish women who arrive visibly pregnant are murdered immediately. If they begin to show after arrival or become pregnant in the camp, they will also be murdered, either in the gas chambers or at Dr. Klauberg's hands. Now, until early 1943, all babies born in the camp were drowned after birth in barrels outside the maternity ward, in effect a barrack designated to give birth in. Then a new inmate arrived, Polish Catholic midwife Stanislawa Liseinska. Assigned to the maternity ward, she was ordered to continue killing the babies, but she refused. It's unclear why her refusal was tolerated, but she arrives only a couple of weeks after Dr. Klauberg starts his work and about the same time as the Roma and Sinti family camp is created. Under her care, 700 births will be registered at the camp, but estimates of the actual number goes up to 3,000. A couple dozen of the newborn are kidnapped and given to childless Aryan couples. Some fall victim to Dr. Klauberg's and his boss Dr. Josef Mengeles' medical experiments. Most simply die of disease and malnutrition. Only around 30 are believed to have survived the war, with only 2 of them identified who still will be alive in the camp on liberation. While the babies may only have gotten a prolonged lease on life by Liseinska's care, the chance of survival for the mothers increases dramatically under her watch. She also clearly hopes that the babies they deliver may survive. It is she who begins the custom of tattooing the babies with numbers like the grown-ups, not out of Nazi bureaucratic fervor, but in a move to enable later identification to bring them back to their mothers should they become separated. Stanislawa Liseinska will survive the camp, return to her hometown of Łódź, and continue midwifery until her retirement in 1957. She will die of natural causes in 1974, a few weeks before her 80th birthday. Never forget.